Hi again then guys, and welcome to another car review of course from GT6 in the past of the franchise of Gran Turismo. This time once again looking at a car which I think has a decent chance of returning in the future of the series, probably more likely in GT7 at this point. This is actually one of the cars though which I would not be at all surprised, more in the past tense now, I guess would have been surprised if it popped up in GT Sport. It just makes sense. I could totally see that happening. Of course it hasn't so far. At this point in the game's cycle, GT7 is probably a more likely place, if any. And the funny thing about the F430 Scuderia, which of course is a fan favourite, one of the most hardcore road-going Ferraris, certainly up until that point, is it's more of a car which gets what I would call retroactive love from the fandom. And what I mean by that is actually fairly simple. There are certain cars that people love and use all the time when you're playing a current game. There are other vehicles which get overlooked, and of course I talk about a lot of those on the channel, and then there's the third major category which this falls into, and that is that people tend to love it more when it's taken away. And of course that applies to a lot of things in life, supply and demand, people want things when they can't have it, and there are certain cars that really applies to. For instance, take the Ferrari F430, another car that I reviewed recently in GT6. It's a car which I barely ever saw people using online in Gran Turismo 6, and yet so many people retroactively love the car and would love to see it come back in Gran Turismo. The Scuderia is exactly like that. Now, this one did get more use from what I saw than the F430 did, for obvious reasons. It's more of a track-focused car, but even so, you did not see anywhere near as many of these around, at least I didn't, as you did, for instance, LP560s from Lamborghini. Now that, to me, is a little bit disappointing because the car offers a lot, and that is one of the reasons why I believe this could easily resurface with a lot of usability in Gran Turismo's future. Now the regular F430 is already a good car. Of course, the 360 was as well, but it's always the more hardcore versions of those cars which are where the real gem, the real polished diamond comes out of the platform. So for the 360, for instance, the Challenge Stradale is where it got really good, and then for this one, this Scuderia is where the F430 really came into its own. Of course, that's purely talking performance, not necessarily the whole package. Me, for instance, I would not be at all surprised if I preferred driving a normal F430, because it's a little bit more restrained, probably a little more comfortable, maybe even a little bit more forgiving. And yet this one is more the kind of car for people who want that true hardcore track day experience. The Superleggeras, the Scuderias, the Challenge Stradales, the MC Stradales from Maserati, for instance. This is that kind of car, and it's a great example of it. Now the engine, as the name suggests, is of course a 4.3 litre, hence the 430. The power is hiked up a little bit. It's actually not a crazy difference between the normal 430 and this one. The regular car has 483 horses, this has 502. So not a massive difference, only about 20 horsepower separates them stock. Even the torque is barely any different. 343 on the normal car, 347 on this one, so hardly any notable difference. The weight though is where things really change. 100 kilos is dropped out of the regular F430 compared to this car. That means that this car stock literally weighs the same as a GT3 car in this game, such as the BMW Z4 GT3, or if I recall correctly, something like some of the GT3 spec Nissan GTRs. That difference from 1450 kilos to 1350 is huge, and that is where you notice the difference. Now to me, I love what Ferrari did there, because they truly understand, and this is something which Ferrari has always had a great handle on. If you look across Ferrari's history, they very rarely go for sheer power. In fact, so rare that they hardly ever do that. To have a 700 or 800 horsepower Ferrari, certainly as a road car, is a very rare thing. This is why it doesn't need to be. A slight hike in power, a tiny advantage in torque, but a huge drop in weight, tighter suspension, quicker gear changes, maybe a little bit more downforce here and there. It can make all the difference because they're already inspired by F1 tech. They are essentially race-bred vehicles for the most part, certainly throughout their history, and this is a perfect example of that. It feels like a GT4 machine on the street. And even though, as I said, I may prefer the regular F430 over the Scuderia purely for more comfort and real-world based reasons, I totally understand why people love the Scuderia. Their used prices in real life are crazy, so obviously everyone does love them, including the market, and even in the game the price tag is pretty hefty. It's just over 300,000 credits, which is more like the kind of territory you'd think of as being like an SLR level kind of price, in real life at least. Now the regular F430 is 243 grand, so there's about a 60 grand difference between the two. That's hefty, but you know, in Gran Turismo earning 60 grand doesn't take that long, so it's not too crazy. And even in terms of the classification and what you can do to the two cars, they actually don't change that much. Even if you look way back on the channel to the potato cam days to my speed tunes, there's not that much between them. So as you would correctly assume, the real difference comes on the track, because it depends what you need from the car. The F430 is smoother, a little bit heavier, a little bit more planted, and a little bit more forgiving. The Scuderia is not. It's more raw, it's more hardcore, certainly more focused, louder, more visceral. But the interesting thing is, the handling and the steering and the manners of this car have aged a lot better than the 599 has, that's for sure. In my review of that car, I mentioned that I actually didn't like how it feels now with GT6's physics. It doesn't really treat the car that well. This one has aged very well. It is more of a super premium, great graphics, fully detailed interior, great sound, some visual modifications as well. So clearly they love the car and they put a lot of effort into it, and you can tell it's a really good car in the game. Now in terms of how it would compare within Gran Turismo to something like the Lamborghini equivalent, the LP560 for example, well obviously that car is technically more of a rival to the regular F430 because it's not, for instance, a Superleggera Gallardo, but it's about as close as you can get, and there are of course some other options, Nissan GTR technically, you know, Audi R8. The Ferrari compares really well to a lot of those. It doesn't have the grip advantage of a GTR or an Audi, but in terms of comparing it to the Lambo even, well, the all-wheel drive doesn't help the Lamborghini that much. In Gran Turismo, the all-wheel drive handling of Lambos is all over the place. This Ferrari is planted, it's actually still surprisingly forgiving, and it's really good. There's a little bit of slip, as you'd expect from a high-revving, mid-engine rear-wheel drive Ferrari, but it's actually really good. It holds up really well, though so much time has passed, and I believe it would integrate really, really well back into Gran Turismo. And the reason why is actually fairly simple. It's just over a 500 horsepower car, which can easily keep up with its rivals from stuff like a 60 or 70 horsepower advantaged Lamborghini Gallardo. So if it can do that, well, in the N classes, regardless of performance points, just on power alone, in the GT Sports system for instance, that's a great advantage, because in N500 this thing would be formidable. It's already light, it's already great through corners, it's got that raw kind of race car engine, certainly feels like one. So yeah, I believe this would actually integrate really well back into Gran Turismo. If anything, this would certainly be more useful than a regular F430, but I think a lot of people would probably love both of them if they were indeed going to bring them back. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the Scuderia. Tell me yours down below. I know it's very much so a fan favourite car, kind of like the Lexus LFA as well, and until next time I'll see you then, but for now, as always, thanks for watching.